And we are back for Overanalyzing House of the Dragon, our analysis of Fire and Blood to understand why the Dance of the Dragons happened between Rhaenyra's Blacks and Aegon's Greens. And through this whole analysis, we've been stressing that the history we are reading is biased, and now we have come to a section all about this topic. And here we must digress to say a word about our sources, for much of what happened in the years that followed happened behind closed doors, in the privacy of stairwells, council rooms, and bedchambers, and the full truth of it will likely never be known. We have, of course, the chronicles laid down by Grand Maester Runketer and his successors, and many a court document as well, all the royal decrees and proclamations, but these tell only a small part of the story. For the rest, we must look to accounts written decades later by the children and grandchildren of those caught up in the events of these times. Lords and knights reporting events witnessed by their forebears, third-hand recollections of aged serving men relating the scandals of their youth. Whilst these are undoubtedly of use, so much time passed between the events and the recording that many confusions and contradictions have inevitably crept in. Nor do these remembrances always agree. And so now we hear a bit about the sources for the story that is put in front of us. The following paragraphs are the strongest proclamation from George R. R. Martin that the history we are getting is not really accurate and the truth is either lost or something that we must puzzle out. This very much parallels our own world, where much of human history is written down hundreds of years after an event has happened, from biased second-hand or third-hand sources and contradicted by other sources. These new paragraphs on the sources, by the way, do not appear in The Rogue Prince, and overall, they come off as a bit odd. Why do these events get detailed explanations on who the sources are, with a warning about bias and exaggeration, while the rest of Targaryen history does not? Did the previous periods have information that was not behind closed doors? Do other periods have less bias? Did no one else write any tell-all books in history? Why does Gildayn feel the need to attribute sources during this period but not at other times? It all really doesn't make much sense, and the real answer to why this is that more time was spent by our author on the Rogue Prince and the Princess and the Queen in creating conflicting accounts and an ambiguous history, while the same care was simply not given to the first half of Fire and Blood. Now, for as much as the paragraph claims that many sources are used, including ones that come decades later, we for the most part don't actually hear much about these other sources. No, rather we mainly hear about the three primary contemporary sources: the Grand Maester perspective, which is currently Runketer, the Court's Fool perspective, Mushroom, and the Septon's perspective, Eustace. And as biased as these three sources are, what's funny is that having three primary contemporary sources makes this account much more accurate than, say, nearly all of Roman history in our world. This is not to say that Runketer, Mushroom, and Eustace are good sources. They are all pretty bad, comically so, but our author seems to be making a statement about our own history. We believe tales about our past that we really shouldn't believe at all. Much of our history is little more than myth. Now, the first source that we hear about is Runketer, the Grand Maester. His account is clearly preferred by Archmaester Gildayn, as he is a maester as well, though Runketer doesn't seem to have written down much, and when he did, it lacked detail. The Maesters are, of course, accused of causing the Dance of the Dragons by Archmaester Marwyn, and so we should expect to see some sort of bias in the Maester perspective and some scheming. Though admittedly with Runketer, there isn't much to examine. There are a couple moments in history where one can perhaps raise an eyebrow at Runketer's actions, namely with regards to Viserys remarrying, but for the most part, Runketer is a minor player and dies in 112 before many significant events occur. The later Grand Maesters, Melos and Orwyle, are a bit more interesting. Unfortunately, this is also true of the two accounts by first-hand observers that have come down to us. Septon Eustace, who served in the Royal Sept in the Red Keep during much of this time, and later rose to the ranks of the most devout, set down the most detailed history of this period. As a confidant and confessor to King Viserys and his queen, Eustace was well placed to know much and more of what went on. Nor was he reticent about recording even the most shocking and salacious rumors and accusations, though the bulk of the reign of King Viserys, first of his name, and the Dance of the Dragons that came after, remains a sober and somewhat ponderous history. Next we find that the bulk of history is based on the writings of Septon Eustace, who Gildayn seems to praise for being thorough, detailed, and in the know, Though there are a couple things that are glaringly off about Eustace that Gyldayn tries to pass off as praise. First of all, Gyldayn claims that Eustace is a great source as the confidant and confessor of Viserys, Aemma Arryn, and Alicent Hightower. Except that should actually make Eustace a horrible source. If Viserys or the queens told him anything, he is religiously obligated to be silent on it. This means that either Eustace was a horrible, horrible septon, as he broke a sacramental seal and divulged information, or he was a good septon and wrote nothing about what he heard, which means being a confidant and confessor is absolutely meaningless. The other compliment that is odd is the statement that Septon Eustace does not shy away from discussing the most shocking and salacious rumors in history, something that Gyldayn then criticizes Mushroom of doing in the very next paragraph. Gyldayn seems to imply that writers would omit the salacious, and Eustace is good for resisting this urge, but we know that clearly the opposite is true. Storytellers add rumors and falsehoods that are interesting to make their writing more entertaining. Now, it is very clear that Septon Eustace has an anti-black faction slant. He is especially critical of Daemon Targaryen, and Gyldayn tells us that he has no love of Rhaenyra. Though this does not mean that Eustace is necessarily pro-green. He is notably very critical of Criston Cole, Aemond One-Eye, and Aegon II, a king that he actually anointed. What is rather telling, though, is that there is no criticism or blame ever placed on the Hightowers by Septon Eustace. And it's notable that after the Dance of the Dragons, Septon Eustace rose within the Most Devout, which is a council of high-ranking clergy in the Faith of the Seven, stationed in Old Town during this period. And while we aren't positive that the Most Devout are filled with Hightowers during Eustace's time, they were certainly filled with Hightowers a generation earlier during Jaehaerys' reign, and the Hightowers are rather famous for being great patrons of the faith. And so while you may hear from some that Eustace is anti-black and pro-green, he seems more specifically pro-Old Town and pro-Hightower. To balance Eustace, we have the testimony of Mushroom, based upon the verbal account of the court fool, set down by a scribe who failed to append his name, who at various times capered for the amusement of King Viserys, Princess Rhaenyra, and both Aegons, the second and third. A 3-foot-tall dwarf possessed of an enormous head, and he avers an even enormous member, Mushroom was thought feeble-minded, so kings and lords and princes did not scruple to hide their secrets from him. Whereas Septon Eustace records the secrets of bedchamber and brothel in hushed, commendatory tones, Mushroom delights in the same. And his testimony consists of little but ribald tales and gossip, piling stabbings, poisonings, betrayals, seductions, and debaucheries, one atop the other. How much of this can be believed is a question the honest historian cannot hope to answer, but it is worth noting that King Baelor the Blessed decreed that every copy of Mushroom's chronicle should be burned. Fortunately for us, a few escaped his fires. Next we hear of the third source, that of Mushroom the Court Fool. Now, according to Gyldayn, Mushroom was thought to be feeble-minded like other fools in our story, like Patchface and Jingle Bell. But Mushroom most closely parallels Moonboy, seen as feeble but who is also likely perfectly normal, just a good actor. As a dwarf, a crass one at that, we are of course supposed to think of Tyrion with Mushroom. Mushroom later claims he was an advisor of Rhaenyra on Dragonstone, her de facto hand, and he is also said to love Rhaenyra, which reminds us of the Tyrion plot from the later seasons of Game of Thrones, when Tyrion was an advisor and hand for Daenerys, and she planned for a war from Dragonstone. But here we see a bit of contradiction. Gyldayn compliments Mushroom's access as he is seen as feeble-minded, but if he is valued as an advisor, then clearly he wasn't seen as mentally impaired, at least by the time of the dance. Even early in Viserys' reign, Mushroom is called a court gossip and an informant at one point, so it seems that Mushroom was not in fact ever considered truly feeble-minded by anyone, and as with Septon Eustace, he had no special insight or access. In fact, there is no point in the history where it is clear that Mushroom's position as a mentally challenged fool allows him any special information, just as there's no point in the history where Eustace as a confessor allows him any special information. Now, as with Eustace being considered inaccurately pro-green by some paint Mushroom as pro-black, and Gyldayn on 2 occasions says that Mushroom loved Rhaenyra. However, this isn't really the case. Mushroom writes very ill of everyone, including Daemon Targaryen, Corlys Velaryon, Laenor Velaryon, Rhaenyra's children, and Rhaenyra herself. If anything, he seems to be pro-mushroom, with a desire to add more sex, murder, and deception into the story. Now, with his parallel to Tyrion, we cannot ignore how Tyrion in later seasons of Game of Thrones thought of Daenerys. He believed in her and was in love with her before eventually becoming disillusioned. And there are some points in the history where one could look at Mushroom in a similar way. Mushroom reports that he once told Rhaenyra that he wanted to marry her, and she laughed, and the reply of a laugh was a sweet sound to him. And so perhaps the best way to think of Mushroom and his writings is to think of him as a selfish, self-loathing, lovesick man filled with bitterness and sympathy simultaneously, the same as Tyrion Lannister. Mushroom's chronicles were ordered to be burned by Baelor the Blessed, who also ordered the same of Barth's unnatural history. We are led to believe that Baelor's decision to do so was because of Mushroom's crassness, though one does wonder if Mushroom's writings have important information on dragons. Septon Eustace and Mushroom do not always agree upon particulars, and at times their accounts are considerably at variance with one another, and with the court's records and the chronicles of Grand Maester Runketer and his successors. Yet their tales do explain much and more that might otherwise seem puzzling, and later accounts confirm enough of their stories to suggest that they contain at least some portion of truth. The question of what to believe and what to doubt remains for each student to decide. And so here again, Archmaester Gildane warns us of the bias and inaccuracy of the various accounts, with a rather explicit command to the reader that they need to puzzle out the truth for themselves. The question of what to believe and what to doubt remains for each student to decide. And so we will continue to try to puzzle out the truth when the time comes. Of course, Gildane's warning of bias and request to figure out the truth for oneself is super ironic, as we have been grappling with the fact that Gildane himself is a very biased source, and it's been rather challenging to determine what has happened up until this point. The story gets hazier and hazier. On one point, Mushroom, Septon Eustace, Grand Maester Runketer, and all our other sources concur. Sir Otto Hightower, the King's Hand, took a great dislike to the King's brother. It was Sir Otto who convinced Viserys to remove Prince Daemon as Master of Coin and then as Master of Laws, actions the Hand soon came to regret. As commander of the City Watch, with 2,000 men under his command, Daemon waxed more powerful than ever. On no account can Prince Daemon be allowed to ascend to the Iron Throne, the Hand wrote his brother, Lord of Oldtown. He would be a second Maegor the Cruel, or worse. It was Sir Otto's wish, then, that Princess Rhaenyra succeed her father. Better the realm's delight than Lord Flea Bottom, he wrote. Nor was he alone in his opinion, yet his party faced a formidable hurdle. If the precedent set by the Great Council of 101 was followed, a male claimant must prevail over a female. In the absence of a true-born son, the king's brother would come before the king's daughter, as Baelon had come before Rhaenys in 92 AC. So next we transition from the description of the sources to a discussion of Otto Hightower's hatred of Daemon Targaryen. Now it's rather subtle, but this transition is awkward as Gildane is talking about sources agreeing on something that is clearly a fact. Otto's letter to his brother by itself proves that Otto hated Daemon. Attribution to Runketer, Eustace, and Mushroom is wholly unnecessary. And the reason for this awkwardness is that our author was trying to transition from his new paragraphs on sources back to the Rogue Prince material. And there is another important retcon about Daemon, Alicent, and Otto that we should talk about. This is the Rogue Prince. Though the origins of their enmity are much disputed, all men agree that Sir Otto Hightower, the King's Hand, took a great mislike to the King's brother. The King's Fool Mushroom asserts that the quarrel began when Prince Daemon deflowered Sir Otto's young daughter Alicent, the future queen, but this scurrilous tale is unsupported by any other source. It was Sir Otto who had convinced Viserys to remove Prince Daemon as Master of Coin and then as Master of Laws, actions he soon came to regret. So here we find that originally in The Rogue Prince, our author had an accusation that Daemon slept with Alicent. In fact, this isn't the only place in Fire and Blood where this rumor has been removed. Now, Mushroom's rumors are all over the place, with him saying that Alicent had sex with Jaehaerys and Viserys as well, and so it's an interesting question to why our author consciously chose to remove this one rumor. And if I had to guess, I think what our author was really saying with these events is that Alicent was in fact sleeping with Viserys prior to their marriage, and this affair was why she was chosen to be married by Viserys so quickly after Aemma Arryn's death. Either Viserys had true romantic feelings for Alicent, or he felt obligated after taking the girl's virginity like Robb Stark did with Jane Westerling. And so rumors were probably going around about Alicent wanting moon tea or something like that, and Daemon was seen as the culprit wrongly. However, I can also see how this rumor adds unneeded complexity to the story and doesn't really fit with the characters. Would a power-hungry Daemon really waste his time on Alicent? Would a power-hungry Alicent really waste her time on Daemon? Outside of genuine romantic feelings for one another, there is no reason for these two to interact, and it takes away from their Game of Thrones. Also, the rumor is kind of ridiculous as we hear about many people hating Daemon, not just Otto. It seems like an entire conspiracy of people were against him. The question is, why exactly? And we never get a clear answer. Some might say that Daemon proved himself savage as the head of the City Watch, but the hatred for him clearly preceded that. What exactly did Daemon do wrong? We have little idea. What we do get is Otto saying that Daemon would be like Maegor the Cruel, which is a bit perplexing. Would Daemon really start a religious war with the Faith of the Seven? Because Daemon doesn't seem to have any direct feud with the Faith. Does Daemon want to usurp the throne by force? Because he never does that either, choosing instead to play within the rules of succession. No, it's Otto who actively tries to get Daemon passed over. So how is Daemon like Maegor? Well, besides being dragon riders, the big similarity between Maegor and Daemon is that they were both stuck with barren wives and wanted freedom to marry again or divorce, and they were denied. Now, maybe the Hightowers just really care about the institution of marriage, but there seems to be a focus on keeping these men in particular in marriages where they cannot procreate. Maegor the Cruel's first barren wife was in fact a Hightower, which makes one wonder if the real issue was bloodline and genetics, perhaps something to do with the hatching of dragons. Now, it's rather telling that Otto uses the term Lord Flea Bottom to mock Daemon. Although Gildain claims that this was the term that the small folk used for Daemon, Otto is actually the only person in story that says it, which makes one wonder if it was actually Otto's term rather than the small folks. I have trouble believing that the small folk would choose a derogatory name using Flea Bottom when Daemon was commander of the Watch for the whole city. It doesn't make any sense unless you're a snooty outsider who believes that the whole city is pretty much the same as the slum Flea Bottom. Now, I will say the language of Otto's letter is a pretty neat little puzzle and reveals quite a bit about our story, namely when the letter was sent, which is incredibly significant. So, we are told that Daemon is nicknamed Lord Flea Bottom near the end of 105, which is around the same time that Aemma Arryn died. Except that Daemon is exiled within days of Aemma Arryn's death. This is rather significant as prior to Aemma Arryn's death, her future child would be considered the heir. Aemma is pregnant for most of 105. But once Daemon is exiled, he's no longer Lord Flea Bottom and Rhaenyra is named heir. The letter must have been sent in the small window of time after Aemma Arryn's death, but before Daemon's exile, which is huge. Keep in mind, in the history that we will soon be reading from Gildain, Daemon got exiled and passed over because of his dumb mouth making jokes. Except, let's look at this order of events. Aemma Arryn dies, then Otto sends a letter saying that something must be done about Daemon, and then Daemon is exiled and passed over. So either there was a massive coincidence and Otto got exactly what he wanted just after messaging his brother about what he wanted, or Otto was the one who was truly responsible for Daemon's exile. Now, it's rather funny that Gildain calls the ruling of the Great Council of 101 a formidable hurdle that Otto and his party must get over. In the end, Viserys just declared Rhaenyra his heir. There didn't seem to be any hurdle at all. As for the king's own views, all the chronicles agree that King Viserys hated dissension. Though far from blind to his brother's flaws, he cherished his memories of the free-spirited, adventurous boy that Daemon had been. His daughter was his life's great joy, he often said, but a brother is a brother. Time and time again, he strove to make peace between Prince Daemon and Sir Otto, but the enmity between the two men roiled endlessly beneath the false smiles they wore at court. When pressed upon the matter, King Viserys would only say that he was certain his queen would soon present him with a son. And in 105 AC, he announced to the court and small council that Queen Aemma was once again with child. And so here we hear a little of Viserys, a hater of dissension, which makes him much like Robert, But what is most interesting here is our author and Gyldain are being insanely sneaky. By placing Otto's letter in the previous paragraph before the paragraph about the announced pregnancy of Aemma Arryn, it makes it seem like Otto wrote his brother about Daemon Targaryen well before Aemma Arryn's death. Gyldain makes it seem like there was a problem, but then everyone's mind was put at ease with Aemma Arryn's pregnancy in early 105, and by the time we get to Daemon's exile, the reader has forgotten about the letter. But again, we are quite specifically told that the Lord of Fleabottom nickname was given in late 105, not early. Otto's letter definitely came after Aemma Arryn's death, not before her final pregnancy. That is the urgency regarding Daemon and the need to switch heirs in the letter. In early 105, with Aemma Arryn still young and alive, it's difficult to imagine the perilous tone. Anyway, figuring out that Otto was in fact responsible for Daemon's exile is a fun little puzzle that George R. R. Martin put in, something one would certainly miss on one's first read, and it shows the time and care he gave to the Rogue Prince, which can be somewhat contrasted with the rest of Fire and Blood. And this is a good place to stop. In Part 9, we will cover Criston Cole and the death of Aemma Arryn. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.